زكاتك تدفع عنك البلاء وتحفظ مالك أن أقام.
الحمد لله رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام على أشرف الأنبياء والمرسلين صلى الله عليه وعلى آله وأصحابه أجمعين. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh, and welcome back to the short series on the contemporary laws of Zakat. This is part 2 of the series, and today we'll be discussing the definition of Zakat, what is Zakat, and on whom is Zakat obligatory. So when we look at the definition of Zakat, we have the linguistic definition and we have the Shar'i definition or the technical definition. From a linguistic perspective, Zakat actually means to grow or to increase. The technical or the linguistic definition of Zakat is nama, to grow or to increase. The Shar'i definition, when we apply or use this word Zakat from a Sharia perspective, it means to purify one's wealth by distributing a specified amount that has to be given to poor Muslims. So the objective of Zakat is to purify one's wealth, as we discussed in part 1 of the introduction. A specified amount has to be distributed that has been specified from the side of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and then it cannot be given to anyone. There are specific poor Muslims that this wealth has to be given to. Now, who is liable for zakat, or what are the conditions that create liability for zakat in an individual? Firstly, it has to be a Muslim. Zakat is only due on Muslims. Secondly, the person has to be a free person, meaning they cannot be a slave. Of course, in today's times, slavery is not in vogue and therefore not applicable. But historically, zakat would not be due on a person who was a slave. A person has to be aqil. He has to have sanity in terms of the Shari definition, not necessarily in terms of the medical definition, but from a Shari perspective, a person needs to have sanity. And if somebody has a question around this, then contact your local ulama to understand whether a particular patient falls within the category of aqil or not. The individual has to have reached the age of majority. That means they have to be baligh, or reach the age of puberty from an Islamic perspective. And then they need to possess the nisab, which is the minimum amount of wealth that results in someone becoming liable for zakat. And that wealth needs to be possessed for an entire lunar year. So these are the conditions. If an individual finds themselves ticking all of the boxes that we find here in front of us, then that person will now become liable to pay zakat. Some related masail with regards to the conditions for zakat. A person who becomes a murtad, who leaves the fold of Islam, then during that time, he is no longer, whilst he is a murtad, if he does not revert back, he is not liable for zakat, as he is now out of the fold of Islam. In the Hanafi mazhab, and this is restricted to the Hanafi mazhab, those who are the followers of the Hanafi mazhab, zakat is not due on minors. So a person that does not reach the age of puberty, even though they may possess a lot of wealth, more than the nisab amount, and for more than a lunar year, zakat will not be liable on them until they reach the age of majority. Now, something that's important, just as a side note to understand here, is that when we talk about the ages of a person becoming or reaching the age of puberty, of course, on the one hand, there are certain physical changes that take place, which if they take place results in a boy or a girl reaching the age of puberty. However, if they have not experienced those physical changes, then by the age of 15, zakat is now liable on them. But remember, this is 15 lunar years and not 15 years in terms of the Gregorian calendar. So it's important that a person is aware of that, particularly when it comes to zakat, as it kicks in earlier than it would from a Gregorian perspective. Now, when you have a person who is aqil, who is sane from a Shari perspective, and they then lose that aql, or they lose that and they become insane, this person will not be liable for zakat if the insanity lasts for an entire year or more. So a person that is suffering from a mental illness that results in them no longer being sane from a Sharia perspective, if that illness lasts for more than a year, zakat is no longer due on their wealth. And if you have somebody, a patient or someone in your care that potentially meets these criteria, then contact your local ulama and the local muftis to understand whether zakat will be due on this person or not. Now, if we unpack the conditions of zakat, we said that a person needs to possess the nisab for a lunar year. Now, what is the nisab? The nisab is the minimum amount of zakatable wealth, and we calculate this based on the injunctions given to us in the hadith of Rasulullah ﷺ. And there are two benchmarks that have been given. One is a gold benchmark, 20 dinars of gold, and the other is a silver benchmark, which is 200 dirhams of silver. Now, of course, at the time of Rasulullah ﷺ, 1 dinar was equivalent in value to 10 dirhams. Hence, you have two measures, the gold and the silver. Now, if we translate the weight of that gold and silver into contemporary times, or to look at the weight of it, of 1 dinar, we will find that 20 dinars is equal to 87.48 grams of gold, and 200 dirhams of silver is equivalent to 612.36 grams of silver. So you could either use the gold or the silver values in terms of the grams, the weight of the gold or silver, or now we have translated that into your foreign currency or your local currency in contemporary times. So if you go on and you Google, for example, in South Africa from a reputable organization, what is the rand value of the nisab? For example, at the time of doing this video, the rand value of nisab in South Africa was approximately 8,500 rands. So if you have zakatable assets in excess of your personal needs. Now, this is the next important point. What wealth are we looking at? We're not looking at that wealth that is required for your personal needs. For example, your clothing, your furniture, your cutlery, your crockery, the home that you live in, the vehicle that you drive. All of this would not be considered as zakatable assets. Anything over and above that would now be assessed as to whether it exceeds the nisab amount. And we'll unpack this in future videos in terms of exactly what assets are subject to zakat. When we talk about the lunar year commences on the date that a person possesses the nisab. So the moment that you come into that minimum amount of zakatable wealth, the clock now begins to start ticking. And if that wealth remains in your possession for an entire lunar year, you are now liable to pay zakat. So you had the nisab at the beginning of the year, you have nisab at the end of the year, one lunar year, for example, the 1st of Ramadan, 1444, all the way to the 30th of Shaban, 1445, you are now liable for zakat on that wealth that you own on that date. And going forward, your zakat year will be calculated annually on the date. For example, in this case, the 30th of Sha'ban, this will now become your annual zakat date. This year only resets if all of your wealth is lost. So for example, if you had the nisab, let's say you had 15,000 rands on the 1st of Ramadan, 1444, and somewhere along the year in Shawwal, you lost all of the wealth. You actually went into negative, or you had no wealth. Everything got stolen, for example. Now, in that case, because you've lost all of your wealth, you stop the calculation, and you will only restart the calculation when you come back into the position of nisab in the future. How do we calculate zakat? Now, zakat is levied on your zakat base at 2.5%. So your net zakatable assets, you multiply that by 2.5%, and that gives you your zakat liability. Now, what is that zakat base? The zakat base are those assets on which zakat is due. We call them the zakatable assets. And in some instances, if you have liabilities that can be deductible, you will deduct those liabilities from your zakatable assets, and you now have a zakat base, the net amount on which zakat is due. You will multiply that by 2.5%, and that will give you your zakat liability for the year. This brings us to the end of this segment, in which we discussed the definition of zakat, the conditions of zakat, and particularly looking at the nisab and the lunar calendar year, and then a brief overview of how one calculates zakat. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala bless us with the tawfiq to understand. Subhanallahi wa bihamdihi, subhanakallahumma wa bihamdika, nashhadu an la ilaha illa anta nastaghfiruka wa natubu ilayk.
لذلك قال الرسول الكريم فلد بالنداء تفز بالمرام.